Hey there guys, today we're going to be taking a look at what the performance is like when you spend $150 on a mini PC versus $250. How much of a difference does $100 make at this price tier? Are we going to be looking at double the performance in terms of both the CPU and GPU? What is the upgradeability like? We're going to look through all of that because right now these are the two most popular mini PC price categories. So that means there's a lot of people making a decision between getting a mini PC within these price ranges, and we're going to see which one of these is more value for the consumer. And for this comparison, we're going to be using the GMKtec G3, a mini PC that is extremely cheap, and I would not be surprised if we see some insane discounts for this specific system this holiday season. Already, I've seen some great prices for it, and for the price to performance that you get out of this, it is a pretty rock solid value. But of course, we're going to be comparing it to the PELADN WO4. This mini PC is just $100, sometimes even less than $100 more than the G3 here. Main difference in terms of hardware is that this is rocking an Intel N100 processor with 8GB of RAM and a 512GB SSD. This, on the other hand, can be found for around $230 to $250, and it comes with 16GB of dual channel RAM, and it also has 512GB of SSD storage. Both of these systems I really like because they're very easy to open up and upgrade. Both of these have relatively decent upgradeability for what they are. This is one of the few N series mini PCs that actually has two SSD slots, though they are a non-standard configuration. At least with the second one, you are going to have a little bit of trouble finding some decent capacity SSDs that will fit in here, but you do at least have the option. While on the WO4 over here, you get the one already used SSD slot, and then on the cover of it, you can actually find a second SSD slot, though this is only for 2.5-inch SSDs. The I/O on both of these systems is pretty standard for most mini PCs within their category. As you can see, the WO4 has a USB Type-C on the front, while the G3 has absolutely no USB-Cs. I have not had a mini PC with an Alder Lake processor from the N series that actually has any type of USB-C. So this is, again, pretty standard for most mini PCs with this configuration. If we take a look at the back, there are some key differences here. For one, the G3 has two HDMI ports as opposed to the WO4 that has an HDMI and a display port. That really just comes down to the decision on what the OEM wants to do there. It really doesn't have anything to do with any particular specs. What is different here, though, is the fact that the USB ports on the back for the G3 are USB 3.0 ports, while on the WO4 they are USB 2. The reason it's like this is because on the G3 we have one Ethernet jack, while on the WO4 we have two of them. Now, having two Ethernet ports isn't really the most important thing out there, and it's not exactly going to be one of those things where you see this and you decide to buy this over this immediately. But there are some benefits that you have to having two Ethernet ports. For one, if you're looking to use a system for anything like self-hosting, if you're going to be running a NAS, having that second Ethernet port is actually pretty nice because it essentially lets you turn a mini PC like this into a very capable home router. That said, though, they are just gigabit Ethernet ports, so it's not going to be the highest performance that you can see nowadays. Now, some of the key aspects that I want to compare between these two is going to be in terms of performance and in terms of the amount of power that they're using to give you that performance. We're going to be running both systems at their stock configuration. We're not going to be modifying anything. Both of them will have their BIOSes essentially reset to their default setting. So let's jump right on into it. So the first benchmark that I ran on these systems is Passmark, and here you can see the score that I got on the GMKtec G3. And as you can see, it doesn't really excel in any of the categories on here. It's an overall pretty low performing system due to that chip, and that becomes very apparent when we compare it to the WO4. We're looking at more than double the overall score here, with the CPU showing an incredible increase, and while the overall 3D graphics performance isn't great, it's still significantly better than the G3. So in terms of game test, we're only going to do a few, but one of the ones that I didn't want to do is Rift Breaker here because of the fact that it has this built-in CPU benchmark. It really pushes hard onto the CPU and gives you a result, and it also shows you the slowdown that happens in the simulation here. As you can see with the G3 running, the game is an absolute crawl with an FPS in the single digits, and really the benchmark is running at a much slower speed than it should. This becomes very apparent when you run the same benchmark on the WO4 right next to it, and you see that while the FPS that we're getting on here isn't exactly incredible, it's multiple times more performance than what we're getting on the G3, and the benchmark itself actually ends up finishing quicker on the WO4. So this is a real world example of the massive gulf between not just the CPU performance, but the GPU performance as well. Now, the next game that I took a look at is Alien Isolation, and the main reason that I'm taking a look at this one is because really, neither one of these systems is going to be running modern AAA games, but what the WO4 can actually do is it's able to run PlayStation 3 and early PS4 era titles at pretty decent graphics settings and give you some great performance. Alien Isolation is one of those titles that has run really well on a wide variety of systems. I've seen it run really well at ultra graphics settings, at systems that are only slightly more powerful than the 5500U. So the fact that we're running this with the lowest in-game graphics settings and the N100 is really struggling here just shows the vast difference in graphical performance here. And you can see that again here with BioShock Infinite running with the lowest in-game graphics settings at the full 1080p resolution. And again, the N100 is struggling here. It can't even give a consistent 30 FPS. Meanwhile, the Ryzen 5 5500U is going to give you enough headroom that you can run this at higher graphics settings. Somewhere between medium and high is usually the sweet spot for this title if you want to have a consistently above 60 FPS. You can get pretty aggressive if you're willing to sacrifice some FPS there, though I don't think it's worth it. But the key thing here is that this little mini PC is able to let you play a game that did not run at 1080p on the consoles that it originally launched on. The PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 were not running any games really at 1080p aside from a handful of titles. So that means if you're playing this on the WO4, you are getting the equivalent of a remastered experience in comparison to what people had back in the day. And again, this ends up being one of the key differences here. It's the fact that even these older titles, you don't really have a lot of headroom to do much of anything on the N100. For example, bumping up Tomb Raider 2013 up to the medium graphics settings essentially means we are far away from a 30 FPS average. But as soon as you bring in the WO4, you can see a consistent above 60 FPS average with 1% lows that are so close to that average that it pretty much means that you're never going to run into any major dips. Now, of course, this is a built-in benchmark, so it's not 100% indicative of the gaming experience, but the difference is so vast here that there is no world where these are going to be remotely close to each other. So okay, we know that the gaming performance is very clearly on the WO4 side, but overall, if you don't care about gaming, what does the actual difference between these two systems really translate to? Well, I think one really easy way to show the vast gulf between these two systems is to simply open up YouTube, put on a video, and scroll through Reddit, and we can see what the system usage is like on both of these computers. So having a YouTube video playing in picture-in-picture mode with Reddit scrolling in the background pretty much endlessly, and we are using an ad blocker here because we're not savages, the usage on the G3 is pretty intense. We're seeing more than half of the RAM getting utilized, and this is only 8 gigabytes, but more importantly, the CPU is at 100% utilization throughout all of this. That means that if Windows tries to do anything in the background, or if you have Steam in the background, or Discord in the background, all of that is eating into the CPU cycles that you would be using just to use the computer for the most normal basic task. Now, if we jump on over to the WO4 and do the exact same thing, you can see here that the experience is drastically different. Now, this system right now, currently in the middle of this test, had 32 gigabytes of RAM, but that wasn't really going to affect anything because even if we had just the standard 16 gigabytes of RAM that this comes with, you'll see that we're not getting anywhere near that, but we are still getting very close to 8 gigabytes. So if this had only 8 gigabytes, we would be in some pretty dangerous territory. But there's plenty of headroom there, and there's also plenty of headroom when it comes to the CPU. So what exactly does this mean between these two systems here? Well, that means that you are going to have a better overall day-to-day experience using the WO4, but there are some key aspects where the N100 based system here actually does have some merit. And just to see what that is, we have to hook up these systems over to a watt meter. So starting off with the GMKtec G3, here you could see what the power usage is like when it's idle. You'll see most of the time it's going to stick to around 10 watts with the occasional fluctuation based off of whatever Windows is doing in the background, but you will never really see it go past 15 at the highest, and that will usually just be the occasional spike here and there. So about 10 watts is the usual average here. On the WO4, in contrast, though, things look kind of different. There is a lot more fluctuation in terms of the idling here. Again, usually because if there is anything happening in the background where Windows needs the CPU to do anything, it's going to spike up just so that it could give the CPU cores enough juice to complete the task as quickly as possible. In general, the average seems to be somewhere around 12 to 13 watts, but there will be the occasional spike going all the way up to as high as 25 or even 35 watts, just depending on what the CPU needs to do there. When it comes to YouTube playback, the G3 does end up spiking up to around 17 watts. There will be the occasional spike here and there all the way up to 20 watts, but it usually seems to hover around 16 to 17 watts. Now, doing the exact same task on the WO4, you can see here that while we are seeing higher power usage, it's not all that dramatically higher. Of course, you do end up in the same scenario where if there's anything happening in the background on Windows, you'll see the occasional spike in power usage. Sometimes it'll go as high as 35, but it's really almost always for just a split second, and the average here seems to be somewhere around 24. Of course, once we absolutely juice the G3 and overload the CPU with Cinebench and the GPU with Furmark, you could see here that we kind of just end up capping out at around 22 watts. It doesn't really ever go past this. Even if you leave it here for the next 15 minutes, it's just not going to change. So 22 watts seems to be about the maximum that this little system will end up using. The WO4, on the other hand, at its maximum will end up using about 53 watts, going up as high as 54. So a drastic increase in power usage here, but of course it does go along with a dramatically increased level of performance. But that is one of the biggest advantages that the N100 has. But you do have to call into question just how useful that realistically is going to end up being. As you saw when we were just watching a YouTube video and scrolling through the internet, we were already at 100% CPU utilization, which means that we're pretty much always going to be at 100% CPU load depending on what we're going to be doing, and almost everything seems to be capable of pushing it to that limit. And if that's the case, then yeah, even if in its worst torture test scenario it still used less wattage than the WO4, but you also see that its maximum performance is just not as high as the WO4. The WO4 is sometimes not even just 2 times as powerful. We're talking about as high as 4 times more powerful. So even in the worst case scenario where we're overloading the GPU and the CPU, if it's only using double the amount of power from the wall, I really don't see that as a bad thing, especially since 54 watts is really not bad at a worst case scenario. And you saw that as both systems were just being used to browse the internet and watch videos, the power usage was the closest between the two of them. There's definitely still a gap there, but unless you live somewhere where electricity is extremely expensive, there's just no real reason to choose the N100 based off of the power usage in a day-to-day task like that. So after running both of these systems through some tests, what exactly is our conclusion here? Well, look, I have been saying for years now that you should be looking at this price category. You really should be trying to avoid this as much as possible. That being said, there is the fact that you could pick up almost 2 of these for the price of 1 of these. So what that means is that if you just need systems that you could put around the house, put it pretty much every television that you have in your house, these are really great for that, especially because as you saw, it was playing back like YouTube perfectly fine. Yes, when we were doing YouTube and scrolling the internet, we were at 100% CPU usage, but YouTube never once dropped the frame. The built-in hardware acceleration for video on this system is just really great. So as a media device, this is pretty much perfect, and it is what I recommend. But if you want a computer that is going to last you longer, that is going to perform better, that is going to have a wider array of upgradeability, and in general more than likely will live a longer useful lifespan, the WO4 at $230 to $250 is such a great deal. The magnetic top really makes it one of the best mini PCs in general that I've ever used because of just how easy it is to get it in there and upgrade everything. And at $230, you saw that it is multiple times more powerful than this device. We're not talking about you're paying $100 to get a system that is 20% faster. It's even 50% faster. No, we are talking about something that is 2 to 4 times faster for an extra $100. I don't know about you, but I think that that is worthwhile because at the end of the day, those $230 is going to go further with this device. This is already struggling with just playing a web browser. This is already at 100% load when you're just trying to watch a video and scroll through the internet. This will let you do all that while running multiple applications in the background, and it will never break a sweat. Because let's talk about how people realistically use their computers. Are you only using Steam on here? Are you only using your web browser? Or are you running multiple applications at once? You have Discord, you have Steam, you have your web browser, you have the software controlling the RGB lighting of your setup, you have the software that's controlling any other peripherals that you might attach to your computer. All of that is running in the background. All of that is using up CPU cycles. If this is at 100% load doing practically nothing, imagine once you load it up with a bunch of things. If you are that person that only uses the web browser, doesn't really open any other applications or anything on their computer, then yeah, this for as low as $100, this has been $100. Take into account, this is a computer that you could buy for $100, and for that price, yeah, this is insane value. But again, you pay $230 to $250 for this, and you're set for the next few years. You know, because if this is already this loaded up right now, imagine the next Windows update that Microsoft decides to add a bunch of extra stuff on top of Windows. Suddenly, this just booting up is already at 100% utilization. While this, because it's 6 cores with 12 threads instead of just 4 cores with 4 threads, you end up just having so much more headroom. So let me know what you think of this comparison. Which one would you choose between the two? And what are your opinions on how these are pretty much currently the most popular mini PC price tiers?